Bryan Murphy, Environmental Protection Specialist for U.S. Naval Air Facility, Atsugi, Japan. This evening, I would like to talk about an air quality issue which has consumed my professional life for the last 2 years. Briefly, a private Japanese industrial waste incinerator has spewed its toxic emissions into the base's housing area for over a decade. Since joining the Environmental Division in March of 1995, I have been project manager for all incinerator-related issues. In fact, my welcome aboard package included the first draft of our current air quality report, which documents a serious threat to residents' health. The story contains all the torturous cultural and political plot twists one would expect when working environmental issues with the government of Japan, especially when the U.S. military is the pollutant recipient instead of the generator. Alas, these belong in a different presentation, tales I will surely spin in future Old Dominion University courses, if given half a chance. I believe the schedule has me as the last presentation at the end of a very long day. To get everyone in the mood for this presentation, I would like to begin with a little cultural humor. Naze ni watori wa soro o watatano desu ka? Anybody? No? Hante gawa ni watoru tami desu. I don't know what it means either, but my secretary thought it was uproariously funny. With a little background on the base, the incinerator company, and a brief chronology of events leading up to the base's latest air quality study. Next, I will discuss the air quality study itself in 3 parts. First, the methodology used to gather the air samples. Next, the engineering analysis, including the dispersion modeling. And finally, the health risk analysis. Finally, a quick summary of what we gained for our troubles. Atsugi, located about 25 miles southeast of Tokyo, is a joint-use airfield. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, Fleet Air Wing 4, flies P-3 aircraft out of here primarily for anti-submarine warfare. The U.S. Navy Carrier Air Wing 5 supports all the aircraft that fly off of USS Independence. That's about 120 fixed and rotary wing aircraft. NAF Atsugi is an American oasis in the midst of the densely populated Kanto Plain area. About 39 million people in the metropolitan Tokyo area at the last count. It's a self-contained base, has its own bank, its own theater, commissary, exchange, housing areas, drinking water wells, sewage treatment plant. It would be an idyllic picture, except for one thing. This is my nemesis. Jinkanpo company, that's our fence line in the background, and you can see the jogger who is on base property crossing the screen right now. Kanagawa Prefecture Government licensed Jinkanpo Company Limited as an intermediate industrial waste disposal facility, authorized to incinerate general industrial waste such as waste acids, alkalis, plastics, oils, rubber, organic residue, and construction debris, and specially controlled industrial waste, which is hazardous waste by another name, such as waste alkali with pH greater than 12.5, waste oils, and infectious industrial waste. However, observations over several years indicate that Jinkanpo Company uses its license more as a point of departure than as a regulatory document. 3 wet gas scrubber-equipped incinerators, each with a licensed capacity of 10 tons of waste per day. The steam billowing from the stacks indicates that it is probably operating all 3 scrubbers. While apparently capable of removing the heavier particulate emissions, they appear inadequate to capture other emissions: volatile organic compounds, vapor, heavy metals. Typically, residual white smoke with a distinctly chemical odor hugs the ground after the steam dissipates. People exposed to Jinkanpo Company's emissions suffer breathing problems, often chronic and severe upper respiratory disease, headaches, nausea, and eye, nose, and throat irritation. Jinkanpo Company is situated 250 meters from the NAF Atsugi family housing area. A total of 8,000 people live and work within a 1 kilometer radius of Jinkanpo Company. We have 2,750 people living in the NAF Atsugi family housing area, a number soon to rise to 3,400 when these two high-rises are completed. We have our Department of Defense Dependent School, elementary school, our youth center, and our child development center for very small children. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force family housing is a block of apartment buildings here, 1,400 of them. 900 students and employees of the Ryuhoku Middle School, which is a Japanese school. We have about 800 owners and employees of the Ayase Industrial Complex, and about 1,500 residents of the Fukaya neighborhood that are within a kilometer. Okay. The Jinkanpo Company site presents several difficult engineering challenges which today sharpen the health effects of its emissions. First, the pollution has little chance to disperse in the 250 meters between the incinerators and base housing. Second, the site's depressed location and the incinerator's short smokestack result in a stack height only 12 meters above the housing area's average elevation and below the tower's upper 6 stories. This defeats the smokestack's purpose of releasing pollutants high above the ground where they'll have little effect on the people below. Third, a river valley channels wind over the incinerators, creating a low pressure area in the building's lee during moderate to high southerly wind conditions. This sucks stack emissions even lower and causes fumigation as the pollution flows through base housing at ground level. For 6 months from spring through autumn, fumigation is a daily occurrence. Under these conditions, Jinkanpo Company would need to scrub nearly all hazardous pollutions from its incinerator emissions to adequately protect base personnel. If the technology exists which can clean industrial waste to this level, it is undoubtedly very expensive to install and operate. Finally, Jinkanpo Company secures the scrubbers from sunset until sunrise as an economy measure. Since the company cannot legally operate during these hours anyways, why spend the extra yen to scrub out the pollutants? As you can see, we've been at this for quite some time. Prior to our latest air quality study, the U.S. military had already conducted 2 studies, formally discussed the issue with the government of Japan on 6 occasions, and met informally on numerous others. What did these efforts accomplish? Unfortunately, nothing good. Jinkanpo transformed itself from 4 smallish incinerators, little more than furnaces with short stacks attached, plus an open pit burn area, to its present configuration of 3 larger incinerators equipped with anti-pollution controls, which it rarely used until recently. I suppose one could derive consolation from the fact that Jinkanpo Company stopped its open pit burning and spent millions of yen installing the pollution control equipment. However, anecdotal evidence suggests that the problem is worse today than ever. The bigger furnaces attached to the scrubbers belch far more smoke than their predecessors. What was wrong with the first 2 air quality reports? Very simply, the researchers never meant to conduct comprehensive tests. They gathered a few samples during scoping visits preceding development of the be-all, end-all monitoring program, long-term monitoring program. These studies did not produce enough data to support a compelling argument that emissions from Jinkanpo Company caused health problems for base personnel, or even that Jinkanpo Company was the primary contributor to the base's poor air quality. Furthermore, the harder the U.S. pushed these limited Navy studies, the more they appeared to lack objectivity and credibility. U.S. arguments quickly degenerated to emotional pleas for the government of Japan to do the right thing. Meanwhile, the government of Japan reduced the entire issue to a question of whether or not Jinkanpo company was complying with Japanese law. When the government of Japan produced no evidence of a broken standard, it became increasingly reluctant to discuss the issue further. In July 1992, NAF Atsugi's commanding officer recognized that U.S. Forces Japan had wrung all the mileage out of the Navy's first two air quality studies that it could. He urgently requested the Navy Energy and Environmental Support Activity implemented scoping study recommendation for a comprehensive air monitoring program. The air quality report, from conception to final product, took over 3 years. I believe it was time well spent. The report incorporated several innovative aspects which enhanced its effectiveness and continues to form the cornerstone of U.S. efforts to improve NAF Atsugi's air quality. A team from Naval Facilities Engineering Service Center in Port Hueneme, California, gathered 37 simultaneous sample pairs at 2 locations over an 8-week period. Air dispersion modeling done beforehand predicted that Site 1, which was about 200 meters abeam the wind line, was the best available background site on base property. And Site 2, which was 150 meters directly downwind of the incinerator, would receive the heaviest concentrations of incinerator emissions. The team gathered samples per the US EPA's Compendium of Methods for the Determination of Toxic Organic Compounds in Ambient Air, except for PM10 procedures, which are delineated in 40 CFR Part 50 Appendix B. The team used several different types of equipment to gather samples: Suma canisters and 10X tubes for volatile organic compounds, puff cartridges for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, polychlorinated biphenyls, polychlorinated dibenzo P-dioxins, polychlorinated dibenzo P-furans, and pesticides. And it used quartz filters for particulate matter less than 10 microns, chromium, selenium, arsenic, and lead. Finally, the team set up a meteorological station at the Downwind site, which monitored wind speed and direction, air temperature, relative humidity, and barometric pressure. It took readings every minute, averaged over an hour. The prime subcontractor, RTP Environmental Associates of Westbury, New York, used US EPA Industrial Source Complex Atmospheric Dispersion Model, ISCST2, for its impact analysis. ISCST2 was then the most up-to-date, refined code approved for modeling complex industrial sources. Neither the government of Japan nor Jinkanpo cooperated with the study, so RTP needed to make several assumptions about the incinerator's design and operating parameters, and drew on 3 data sets to develop an emissions inventory. The first was the recently completed ambient air monitoring study. Second was a government of Japan stack monitoring report, which provided some emissions rate information. And third were emissions factors typical of municipal solid waste incinerators. With these assumptions and data sets, RTP back calculated an emissions inventory and air toxic release rate, then mapped long and short-term concentration isoclefs for both fugitive and stacked emissions. Finally, RTP conducted a preliminary risk assessment by comparing the pollutant concentrations to an amalgam of health guidelines: US EPA ambient air guidelines, air quality guidelines, New York State ambient air quality guidelines and air toxic standards, integrated risk information systems and health effects assessment summary table publications. RTP picked and chose from among a group of standards because no one source listed all the compounds emitted by Jinkanpo Company. Naval Facilities Engineering Service Center used this qualitative risk assessment to determine whether the data justified a more in-depth quantitative health risk evaluation. The engineering study yielded the following results. Samples gathered inside the incinerator's plume consistently produced pollutant concentrations 4 to 10 times greater than background samples. strongly identifying emissions from Jinkanpo Company as the primary source of pollution on base. Also, NAF Atsugi's air contained 12 pollutants at levels higher than U.S. ambient, long, and or short-term standards. Air pollutants from Jinkanpo Company come from two probable sources. First is combustion byproducts resulting from incompletely burned wastes and ineffective pollution control devices and procedures. Specifically, total tetrachlorinated dibenzo P-dioxins, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, hydrochloric acid, cadmium, mercury, nickel, PM10, chromium, and arsenic. The second source of air pollutants was the volatile waste which evaporated before getting into the incinerator due to poor waste handling procedures, such as benzene and carbon tetrachloride. Conclusions of the engineering analysis. The first is that Jinkanpo Company has a significant adverse impact on base air quality. Number two, in the U.S., regulators would force Jinkanpo Company to immediately suspend or modify its operations. And number three, modeling produced sufficient and compelling evidence of elevated health risk to warrant a thorough evaluation. In part two, the health risk evaluation, the Navy Environmental Health Center calculated carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic risk from pollutant concentrations detected on base by the Naval Facilities Engineering Service Center. First, the researchers identified chemicals of concern by comparing pollutants with the emission inventory of the engineering analysis with U.S. EPA Region 3 risk-based concentration tables. Next, they estimated the health risk using U.S. EPA Region 4 preliminary risk evaluation guidelines. They calculated the cancer risk for each pollutant, adding them together to derive total carcinogenic risk in terms of 10 to the minus 6, or additional lifetime cancer cases per million. They also calculated the non-cancer risk for appropriate pollutants, but left them as individual non-carcinogenic risks. The chemicals which cause non-cancer disease affect target organs differently and are not additive. Finally, they presented their evaluation for peer review to groups respected by their Japanese counterparts. Environmental scientists from the U.S. EPA, the National Academy of Sciences, and the University of Florida. After collecting the comments, the Navy researchers either incorporated the various suggestions or addressed them in some other way. The health risk evaluation found the following. The chemicals in the smoke and ash produced by Jinkanpo Company's incinerators are known or suspected to cause cancer and upper respiratory injury and disease. Next, living on NAF Atsugi for 3 years will elevate the cancer risk by 40 additional cases per million adults and 110 cases per million children. The baseline for all cancers in the United States is 250,000 cases per million. We use the 3-year numbers because these most nearly replicate the average exposure period for family housing residents. U.S. EPA considers an activity which increases cancer risk more than 1 case in a million based on a 70-year exposure as unacceptable. The health risk evaluation estimated that 30-year exposure to the base's poor air quality would increase cancer risk by 1,150 additional cases per million with average pollution concentration, or 3,790 additional cases per million at maximum concentrations. The populations most likely to suffer this level of chronic exposure are Atsugi's Japanese employees and the Japanese business owners and workers of the Ayase industrial complex. Finally, the hazard quotients for 3 pollutants significantly exceeded acceptable levels for non-carcinogenic disease risk, primarily upper respiratory diseases. The pollutants were 2 variants of trimethylbenzene and chromium-3. The conclusions of the health risk evaluation. First, pollution at NAF Atsugi's air poses an unacceptable level of risk and imminent health hazard to exposed populations. And second, at the observed levels, U.S. regulators would require a risk-generating activity to immediately suspend operations. Jinkanpo Company's operations have improved marginally in the year and a half since we published our air quality report. It removed an illegal, unlicensed incinerator that operated for 10 years. Number two, it now uses its scrubbers during the day. Number three, it now shuts down from 6 o'clock in the evening until midnight, thus operating illegally only 10 hours per day instead of 16. Most importantly, the report kickstarted a moribund, hopeless process. The government of Japan, probably unsure how to handle the report's impressive cancer numbers, conducted its own air monitoring and inspection program of Jinkanpo Company. It inadvertently documented an array of criminal and civil violations which provided the U.S. with plenty of ammunition to cause mischief. The senior U.S. leadership in Japan, at the area commander's headquarters and the U.S. Embassy, have for the first time demanded action by the government of Japan to fix the problem. Finally, the report moved the whole issue out of the technical legal compliance niche in which it had been stuck and launched it into the political arena where it belongs. We are now engaged in a rather nasty bureaucratic knife fight with the government of Japan over Jinkanpo Company. The final outcome is far from clear, but we seem headed for the critical mass we need to reach an acceptable solution, which is safely breathable air.